Well, I better not take any time telling stupid stories today. Actually, I'm kind of old and boring. I don't have any stupid stories left. And sadly, because I come here so much, you know all of them. You've heard them all, you've endured them. Little family update. We went out of town last week to a safe state, and we visited our daughter who lives in Mississippi. Many of you know Erin and her husband Willie. They drove up from Mississippi, and we drove over. And Johnny and April are home. They've been here. They're supposed to come home in April to have their next baby. They came early because of the virus and airports closing, so they've been here since March, and they leave on Wednesday to go back to Niger. So that's going to be a hard one for us. Yeah. So anyway, we have kind of grown attached to those little guys in the house, and to Johnny's wife April, and we're okay with Johnny. Now they're doing well. Johnny is married. He's doing seminary now, and so he's pretty busy with that, and he's doing different things around. So anyway, pray for them as they leave, Lord willing, on Wednesday to go back to Niger. Their little town, they live basically in the capital city, but their town has a lot of illness right now. There's terrible floods. Some of you are familiar with Sahel Academy in Niamey, and that's been totally flooded. It's still underwater. It flooded about 2 months ago. And so that's caused a bunch of things, but one of the problems with the flooding is the malaria and the cholera. And no one there wants to get tested for COVID, because if it's determined they have it, they have to isolate, and the government charges them for that isolation, probably what they might make in a year of working. So nobody gets tested. So anyway, right now out in Johnny's area, it's been pretty good, but with the flooding, they're not near the flooding. Their house is all dry. There's a lot of people with fevers and everything, and they're hoping it's malaria. Sad thing, when you hope you have malaria. But anyway, let's pray for them as they go back. They're kind of heading into a tough situation. Anyway, I will be over it by next week, Lord willing, when I come back. Either that, or I'll be depressed and I'll be laying in bed and I'll join Zoom and just preach from my pillow. Anyway, turn if you would to Genesis chapter 37. We'll take a look at Joseph. It's always difficult to say, okay, what should we preach on for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks? I don't do a lot of preaching on Joseph, and so I've kind of enjoyed reacquainting myself with this fella. Genesis chapter 37 is where we kind of, we've heard his name before, but we meet him in earnest in Genesis 37. Chosen by God, that's Joseph. Text doesn't say that, but we know the story. He was. And we know the whole story about, we know the end. We know Genesis chapter 50. We know all about his rise to power in Egypt. We know all this before we even read it. And so did the original readers of this book. But Moses writes this under the inspiration, obviously, of the Spirit of God. And he writes this to, I think, to give those people about to leave, or maybe already have left the land of Egypt, to fill in the blanks about Joseph, to fill in the blanks about how they got to Egypt in the first place, 400 years before this is written. It's been preserved for us. I look at this and I say, what do we learn? What is the Holy Spirit teaching the readers of this book? Well, it's a history of Joseph. It's their personal history and how they got to Egypt. But they've met this new guy, Moses. And he's the one who's come to say God's calling us back to Canaan. of the millions maybe of Jews living there at the time in terrible situations, how many of those people believed Moses? How many of them knew Moses? What they knew of Moses was he was a kind of a renegade, a murderer from the palace, a Jewish guy who grew up solidly Egyptian. What do we do with people God has chosen? Do we embrace them as chosen by God? Or are we skeptical of them? What if something like that happened today? And when God chooses people, is it this, light from heaven that comes down? Or is it something as simple as a good idea? And when that good idea is there, do we jump on board? Oh, we might not be as drastic as say, I was chosen of God. I probably wouldn't say that. But in church work, in ministry, in our neighborhood, leadership, do we jump on board with it? Application of these passages on Joseph may tie pretty closely to church leaders, to ministry leaders, but it also probably ties in pretty closely to the rest of us, to all of us who, normal Christians, who want to walk with God, who want to serve him. Starting in verse 2 of chapter 37, this is the history of Jacob. Interesting word there I think it's used 10 times, 10 sections. I might be wrong. I didn't count them before I came, but it's the Hebrew word that's translated here. This is the history. That's how the book of Genesis is laid out. It says, now this is the history of. Some of your translations say this is the genealogy of. Probably the best translation that I would choose on this, because it's interesting. We have just heard all about Jacob. We're done with Jacob by the time we get to 37, pretty much done. He's still alive. But he says, now this is the history of Jacob. I probably wouldn't translate it that way, because now this is all going to be about Joseph. So probably we would translate, this is what became of Jacob. What became of Jacob? Joseph. And now this section, from here till the end of the book, except for chapter 38 with a parenthesis on Tamar, it's all about Joseph. This is what became of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Right away we see Joseph, the one who they already know, the readers already know, who we already know. And what we learn about him that we may not have known before was he showed up with this bad report. And Joseph faced the challenge in verse 2 here of being honest when silence was the much more easy option. But honesty required him to say something. We don't know all the events. Was he just a kind of bratty little kid that tattled on his brothers? I don't know. Was he a righteous young man who could not let sin go unreported? I don't know. But he faced a challenge here. And I guess the point I'm going to try to bring this around to by the time we finish is that when God chooses people for leadership, something as dramatic as leading the nation of Egypt, or something as small as that Sunday school class, when God begins to train leaders, there are going to be challenges. And most of us don't do well in those challenges. Many of us don't. And that's why those ministries don't ever come to fruition because most of us prepare for the big part of ministry and we get wrapped around the axle on the small parts. What about Joseph? How's he going to do here? Face the challenge of being honest when it would have been much easier to stay quiet. Second, verses 3 and 4. Now, Joseph faced the challenge of being favored when that special treatment brought him great adversity. The favored one. You know, I would love to be the favored one. But yeah, I think I'd hate it too. I'd like to have friends, you see. And favored ones usually don't, do they? Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age. And also he made him a tunic of many colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him. Could not even speak peaceably to him. You know, the choice of leaders can often appear to be really unfair. Whether it's something as maybe minor as choosing someone for leadership of a ministry in a church. There's that potential for those of us who thought we should have been chosen to complain about that. Well, you know, what about me? What am I? You know, dog food here? What's the issue? I've been here a long time. But I wasn't chosen. The person who was, well, he's probably related to somebody important. Yeah. It seems so unfair sometimes on how leaders are chosen. It's not like elders got any of this magic stuff that they are infallible. No. My guess is there's elders sitting in many congregations who've never been recognized as such. I'm thinking there's probably deacons in many congregations who are never given the nod. The choice can sometimes appear to be so unfair. Verses 3 and 4, lavished favor toward faithful people can provoke those who are unfaithful. I remember working with a fella that, being with a fella who had been around the church for years and years and years. He was a good guy, a really good guy, but was always not considered in spiritually motivated positions. He was a good guy. But I don't know that there was a person in the congregation who would have thought him qualified for any of these positions. But like I said, a good guy was there. He loved the Lord. Boy, when something, I don't even know how our church structure worked back in the day. He was not asked to be on something. Man, he shared with me that really upset him. His point was, it's my time. I've been here for years. So that choice is what I'm saying. And to the brothers, this choice must have looked really unfair. Joseph. We see that the unfaithful people can be hateful toward those who are faithful, and unfaithful people can speak harshly toward those who are faithful and who are given the nod for work, for service. Joseph's leadership experience began with the challenge of being a favored person. And as much as you and I would love to be favored, we'd probably learn to hate it. because of the expectations that come with it, and because there's always going to be the majority of the people guessing whether or not you should be in that position. And that's the challenge that he faced. Joseph was working, we're told, among the sons of Jacob's wives. Well, they were the sons of the two concubines of Jacob. Remember that whole wacky passage earlier when, I hate that passage where Jacob is being given all these women to father children with? I mean, if you're grossed out by that passage, you should be. It was disgusting, and it's written that we should be disgusted. There was Rachel, there was Leah, there was these two, Zilpah and Bilhah. But he's working among the two of the women's handmaids, among their kids. Now, is there any significance to that? I'm sure there is. I have no idea what it is. But that's where he was. Boy, you talk about being favored in that group. These weren't even sisters-in-law. They were their servants. And these were the kids of the servants, of the wives of Jacob. And here we got number one showing up, Joseph. Did he have a clipboard? Was he taking notes? Coffee break early? I don't know. That's where he was. He was the son of Jacob's favorite wife. Was Jacob setting Joseph up? Was Jacob working to make a leader out of him? All right, I'm going to show your age right now, you people. I want you to finish this statement. Okay? You ready? Highly spiritual stuff here. My daddy left home when I was... I'm carnal in the midst of spiritual giants. My daddy left home when I was 3. And he didn't leave much for Ma. What is wrong with you people? Johnny Cash, a boy named Sue. Thank you, Phil. You know, Einstein, it was said, didn't know his address because his view of the human mind was he thought it could fill. And he didn't want to fill it with trivia that he could find somewhere else. My mind is full of this nonsense. And probably about 35 years ago, anything good or new stopped coming in. Okay? But remember this kid, his dad named him Sue so he would grow up to be tough. The gravel in your gut and the spit in your eye. Oh, never mind. I wonder if Jacob was doing that. I want you to go out with these guys. They're kind of morons, but go out with them and tell me how they do. Boy, that's going to make for popularity in the family, isn't it? He was in a rough group here. Challenge. Future leaders may face the challenge of being favored. And some of you have gone through your Christian experience very, very favored. You were the 4-year-old standing up at the breaking of bread. You were the ones who stepped back when your friends were getting in trouble. Maybe that was because of the call of God on your life. But you grew up a bit of an outcast because you were willing to honor Christ in how you lived. That's a challenge. This guy's being trained to be the leader of the land of Egypt, one of the biggest, most powerful countries at the time. He faced the challenge of being honest when silence was much easier. He faced the challenge of being favored when that special treatment brought him great adversity. Third, verses 5 through 11, he faced the challenge of having been chosen when his adversaries were already angry and envious. Now, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. It's interesting, they hated him in the previous verse, verse 4, and they hate him even more in verse 5. And so they said to him, he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. Indeed, your sheaves stood all around, and they bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. It's bad enough you dreamt it, then you told us about it. So they hated him in verse 4, they hated him even more in verse 5, and they hate him even more in verse 8. Moses is making a point here. They hate him. You know, it's easier to lead when your rise to the top is the result of work and not of luck. Oh, those of us from the work world, we knew so many people who got promoted over us who, in our humble opinion, weren't nearly as good as us, right? Man, I knew a guy that I worked with, and he cleaned boats in San Diego Harbor. That was his job. He was an engineer, couldn't get a job. He cleaned this guy's boat and wound up getting hired by this guy, and he came in as this favored person. The head of the company personally hired him. They wound up in our division. Boy, we were impressed. It wasn't long until he was very high in that division, and it seems like we had to clean up after him all the time. And then he was brought from our division, which was not that big or important, into a bigger division. And he started to, and I remember he called me one time, he said, Bob, I'm starting my own company, would you like to work for me? And I thought, I didn't say it, but I thought, are you out of your mind? Well, that company started and he did so well, and then he sold it for about $1 gazillion. And I kind of lost track of him when I was preparing this week for the sermon. I thought of my friend, and I looked him up. He's the CEO of some big West Coast company right now. And I didn't know if he could make it across the room without falling down. Anyway, when you come into leadership having come through the ranks, you have so much more confidence than when you're handed something. That's why, the King and Queen of England send their kids into the military, not just to build a portfolio, but to have them accomplish something. The dreams were God's confirmation that Joseph would rule over his brothers. And so far in Genesis, God spoke directly through dreams. The dreams that were recorded so far in Genesis did not have to be interpreted. He spoke directly. But this is the first time he spoke using symbols. It's hard to know why. Perhaps because of what was going to happen with Pharaoh later on, that Joseph would be the one who could interpret dreams. The dreams up to this point were nothing to interpret. It was God telling people to do something. But that probably would not have worked with Pharaoh, because he would have just dismissed a blanket statement from God. He would have dismissed it out of hand and said, I'll wait for another God to bring me another message. No, this one came to Pharaoh through symbols. And that's what we have here. They were pretty obvious. Joseph may have been challenged by his boyish naivete here when he told of the dreams. Maybe that was a dumb move on his part. But he did. He proclaimed his inevitable leadership. He did it while his dad was still very much alive and very much the leader. No, Reuben was the actual firstborn. Reuben was the one who the stuff would have been turned over to eventually, but he made a power play in chapter 35, verse 22, following the death of his Aunt Rachel. Dad was probably pretty down because Rachel had died. Verse 22, don't turn, I'll just read the verse. It happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. So there's the firstborn. It's his mindset. He's gonna take charge. He's gonna step in. Dad's weak right now because his favorite wife has died. My mom's gotten kicked around pretty much ever since this marriage, even though my mom is the legitimate wife of Jacob, Leah. But that power play apparently went nowhere, and it served no other purpose that we read about than to hear from his father's dying bed, that his behavior cost him the firstborn right. That's all that did. Joseph's first dream referenced his rise to power among his brothers. That dream is kind of interesting. It indicated he would rise above them. The brothers understood, the ones that were there, that the dream meant that they would serve him, and they hated him, verse 8, even more. The brothers understood the meaning, and they emphatically stated, "You will not rule over us." Joseph was probably not wise, I would guess, in telling his brothers about this dream. But Joseph then, in verses 9 through 11, dreamed the second dream, and that referenced celestial bodies bowing down to him. Wow. And then he dreamed still another dream, verse 9, and told it to his brothers. Man, what, you gonna learn? And they said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." Boy, I wonder who that's referring to. So he told it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" His brothers envied him. But his father kept the matter in mind. Oh, we know that's going to happen. Remember when he's the Lord of Egypt, Prince of Egypt. Those brothers are going to show up, all of them. They're going to bow down before him. That's what his dream indicated. His father was the first to question the legitimacy of this dream. And he rebuked Joseph. He rebuked him for the dream, and he rebuked him for telling them about it. His brothers envied him. And his father, after the rebuke, the text says he observed the saying. He observed what he said. You see, right now, Jacob may be beginning to see in Joseph some parallels to his own story. And Jacob was well aware that God could select a younger son to rule, wasn't he? And he was well aware that God could make that choice known by an oracle. He did in chapter 25, verse 23, when when he said, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 people shall be separated from your body, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. That was Jacob and Esau. An oracle of God. In this case, it wasn't an oracle of God, it was a dream given by God. So Joseph has to be thinking that God could make this choice known by a dream. Jacob may be thinking, Joseph, that special one to me, the one I have always thought special because I was older than the hills when he was born. And his mom was the love of my life. So Jacob was given pause, and he observed carefully what might be going on here. So I've got to wrap this up. How does it work with future leaders? Probably future leaders right here. There's obviously current leaders and probably future leaders. That's exciting. How does God work with them? In most cases, not very gently. That's just it. Oh, it's for lack of a better term, it's a loving roughness, but it can be rough nonetheless. Because he is making leaders. He's not making another one among many. He's making someone who are going to move God's people towards some very cool things. Again, I'm not even putting any mystical stuff here about a call of God or a voice in the dark or still small voice. No. Just talking about people. God's got a plan to use. And they might not even know it. But things start to happen. And people start to follow. Even though the person, the man or woman, doesn't even know they're leading anything. But they're the ones that people look to in the room. Why are they looking to him or to her? They are. And they pretty consistently do. But meanwhile, the rest of us are kind of scratching on those walls to get that same kind of excitement for us, and it's not happening. I don't know what nobody laughs at my jokes, man. They always laugh at his.